So at this point, I'm hoping you have gone through the both the vocabulary of design and the grammar of design. Um, with this presentation, I'm going to get into Gestalt theory in terms of how we perceive visual communication, what's out there. Gestalt is an interesting word, and really, this theory is embedded in the psychological context of how we go through and perceive objects and relationships and things around us, and how all those things kind of add up to the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. We know this as non-summativity, and this gets a little sophisticated to understand. Um, Visual design, visual communication certainly is non-summative. Everything comes together, and as we start to perceive that within context, that physical, psychological, social, cultural idea of context and even temporal, it comes together into a unified whole, and we start to go through and create meaning from that. Okay, so that's kind of the psychological side of that. Let me get to the visual side of that, and maybe in terms of design of objects or photographs, or we're going to go through a lot of different types of design to show these different types of theory. So before I get into that, though, let me maybe get into a better definition of non-summativity by showing you a couple of my favorite things. One is the Golden Gate Bridge. This is very symbolic to me in a number of ways. I grew up there. It's symbolic to me to the history of Northern California. It's symbolism in terms of bringing together two pieces of land that otherwise you'd have to circumnavigate the bay in order to get around to that, to all kinds of things. The engineering of this as well, in terms of when it was constructed, what they had at hand in terms of technology to go through and build such a structure is pretty amazing to me. And all these things come together and mean something more to me than just what just a simple bridge. This is called, it's a house. It's called Falling Water, and it is um, the product of the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. And you might look at this and think of how contemporary it is in terms of its design. And there's some timeless design features involved in this, but the gestalt of all these things that come together go through and keep it timeless in that respect. It might surprise you to know this house was built in 1929. All right, so it's well beyond its time, and yet it's timeless in its ability to go through and be functional in its design. The river runs right through the house. It was built on top of the stream that goes through, and at the very bottom there is the master bedroom, and there's a set of stairs that goes down right to the river. It doesn't go into the river, but it's truly remarkable. This is Gestalt. Again, all these things come together to create more than just a house, okay, in terms of the sum of its parts. So something a little closer, maybe you've been able to visit the fountains at the Bellagio in Las Vegas. If you haven't done that, I encourage you to do so, especially if you're in the vicinity here in southern Utah, to go down there. And this is just air pressure and water, really, these little cannons and some light that are going on, but bring all this together and it creates some remarkable experience. Again, something non-summative. It's beyond the sum of its parts. Or what about this? Now, this might not do anything for you, but I look at this and my heart rate increases. I breathe a little heavier, and not in some weird way, because I'm really excited about what this is and what it represents. This is a 1962 Ferrari California Spider. What you're looking at here is a product of 12 Italian men who go through and put this car together. This is hand-rolled aluminum and hand-laced wheels, everything that comes together in this. This was designed by what's called a carrosserie in Italy called Pininfarina that developed that hip line that you're seeing just above the rear wheel there as it comes up. And yeah, these are feminine terms here in putting this together because those are very classic lines as it works. This car sold at Barrett-Jackson auction here not too long ago for $7 million, if I recall. And again, that might take you back as well, thinking, well, it's just a car, it goes from point A to point B. No, that's like calling the Mona Lisa just a painting here in that respect. And this truly is a work of art. Now, all this comes together for me, okay, for what I bring to the table, for what I bring to my perception of automobiles, something that's very non-summative, okay, because it's of all these things that it represents. By the way, so this is the newest iteration of the California Spider, and it's beautiful, it's certainly modern. It's coming of age. I don't think it's something that Enzo Ferrari himself, who died in 1989 in August, I'm not sure that he would have commissioned something like this, but it's really made a departure. This car doesn't do anything for me in terms of what this car does in terms of its classic aspect. And even though there are some features that are retained, there's a little bit of that hip line. If you look at the structure of the windshield, what's called the A pillar, there's no B pillar in there. It's just this sturdy. Those stanchions that hold the windshield on the Spider go all the way down to the bottom of the frame, just behind the louvers that you're seeing there. Acts as a roll bar as well. And they kind of incorporated the same thing into this. I'm not sure, though, that it maintains the same structural integrity. I can go on all day about this. You get the idea. All right. Well, there are certain principles that come together here in arriving at Gestalt. Gestalt, by the way, the word Gestalt in German means form or shape, which I think is fascinating because these are the words that we're using, right, in this vocabulary of design. Well, the principles include the relationships that exist between figure and ground objects. Okay, so we'll talk about that. The law of similarity, the law of proximity, the law of pragnance, the law of continuity, and lastly, the law of closure. So I'm going to go through all of these. Okay, you don't need to write them all down right now, but follow along with me as I do so. And we'll start with this idea of figure-ground relationships. All right, and this is pretty fundamental for most of us to understand, in terms that elements are perceived as figures, okay, distinct elements of focus, or ground, which is the background or the landscape on which the figures rest. Now, let me pull context in here, okay? That landscape or that background provides context for the figure. Okay, let me demonstrate that for you. A few years ago, I was asked to produce a film that would raise funds to purchase our own life flight helicopter here in southern Utah. And this was no small feat to go through and do. We had to appeal to both the cognitive, effect of our audience and the affective consequences, how they felt about things. And so I wrote 5 different stories that could have ended up in tragedy, where a ground ambulance would not have sufficed in order to go through and save the individuals' lives that are at stake within this. That goes through and shows the need really for an air ambulance in the southern Utah area. And the 5 stories were this little boy, for example, that's his mom and his sister in the background, figure-ground relationships going on there. They're getting a shaved ice. He's thinking he wants McDonald's, which is across the street. In fact, it's across Sunset Boulevard in the Santa Clara area, which is one of the busiest roads around here, and he steps into traffic to get to McDonald's. Another story is a mom and her infant, and they come almost to a head-on collision with a couple of girls who were texting. There's another story of somebody having a heart attack on a golf course. Another story of a mountain climber, a rock climber, and he falls, and so on. So each one of these stories goes through and creates context, and that context happens through these figure-ground relationships. Here you see the mom with the child. In the background of this, with the tar snakes and the line on the asphalt, the canyon of the cars that's created goes through and creates, again, context for that. And the camera pushes down. It actually moves down on an arm, okay, on a crane, and follows her as she puts the child into the car seat. And then we cut to this shot, and we have this relationship between the mom and the child, but behind them is the tire of the vehicle next to them, right? Again, giving us some sense of context with that, some kind of foreboding. The rock climber, we have a close-up of the hand, the chalked hand on the surface, trying to get a handhold, and we go out wider, and then we have figure ground very close together, okay, because obviously the relationship that's happening between them. Or somebody else here in the story, she's stranded on the side of the road out on Highway 91, out in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing out there, okay, and there's a very low-traveled road. This young woman's pregnant, and her water breaks, and it becomes, a very precarious situation for her. And then the hero shot, along comes life flight. And we see it lifting off from the medical center, giving us figure ground relationships going on, and goes through and does a task. And we end the film with this hero shot with the signature landscape of southern Utah, of St. George, with the red Vermilion Cliffs, Pine Valley in the background, and off it goes into the wild blue yonder. So those things come together in a figure ground relationship to go through an established context and tell the story as it goes. The next law is a law of similarity, and this isn't, again, it kind of boils down psychologically how we perceive things. And the idea is that items that are similar are grouped together. Our mind goes through and puts things together. For example, looking at this, we're not seeing really a conglomerate of all these shapes. We're seeing vertical rows of squares and vertical rows of circles. Because of their similarity, we group those together, and so we see these in rows. We don't necessarily see this as a whole conglomerate, right? Well, Mother Nature's filled with all kinds of ideas of this type of reduction, where we see patterns and color and shape and contrast, and we go through and pull something out of that. Okay, we group that together to come up with some kind of meaning. I travel a lot off-road, and one of my favorite roads is the Cottonwood Road that goes just outside of Kanab and all the way up to the Cotacombs Basin. If you follow that road along and look back, you come across what's called the Coxcomb, okay? And if you look in this photograph, you're seeing these cliffs that look like they're jetting up out of the terra firma in this valley. In fact, if you use your imagination, you might think that there was a tail of a dragon that was buried, a huge dragon. But you see as they repeat that pattern as it goes down, okay, that becomes the same concept here in terms of this Gestalt principle. Or this, even the bricks, the pattern of all those that come together, we tend to group all those together. The next law is the law of proximity, and that means that things that are close to each other have a tendency to be grouped together. So I'll go back to my circles and squares and see that we see these as a group of circles and a group of squares. We don't see these as one group put together. Color does that to us. We have a tendency to go through and separate things out and see them as separate. Other patterns like texture here, even though these are, I've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I have 8 vehicles here. They're running together, the bumpers and the headlights and the brows to those headlights, and we only see one in one car. It kind of pulls everything together that way. Or here, all these points of light that go through and create what we know as North Africa and Western and Eastern Europe and the Saudi Arabian area, the lights go through and start to demarcate what's going on. So we pull all that together because of their proximity. And with that proximity, we're able to go through and find some kind of outline there. This is fascinating, a photograph that I've used quite a bit in teaching of this class. And here we have proximity of a number of things, but basically we're looking at the proximity of the icicles, and we see how they become ingrained into the proximity of the mane of this pony. Yeah. And maybe you just now figured out that that's a horse there. The middle line of that barbed wire fence goes through and separates the horse from the cloudy background. But the mane here has the same kind of fall to it as the icicles do. And the brain, okay, according to the Gestalt theory, groups that together because of their proximity and because they're similar. None of these theories are mutually exclusive, by the way, okay? And that's what makes them confusing sometimes. The law of pragnance means that we kind of reduce things down to their simplest form. Let's take the Olympic rings, for example. We look at this as kind of a unified whole, right? And we don't really pay attention to really how sophisticated this design really is. Look at the ellipses that are formed by the coming together of these Olympic rings. If we look at shape, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 obvious rings. Then we have 1, 2, 3, 4 ellipses going on within that as well that make it a little bit more complicated. But we don't necessarily see those according to this law of simplifying things. Forced perspective does that to us. We take a look, we see things, ground relationships that are going on, and our brain goes through and says, "Oh, these must be, four vintage vehicles parked in front of a building." We have light that goes through and plays into this. But the photographer here is doing an optical illusion. He's forcing perspective by taking these model cars, putting them on a table, matching texture in terms of what that foreground looks like. And then the light, which is passed on this photograph, let me go back. You can see the light as it comes across that amber kind of highlight that's on the foreground, and that matches the amber that's hitting the buildings in the background. So all that comes together to go through and form that illusion, because our brain reduces things down to the simplest forms. Here's another idea. The same photographer who's doing this with more vintage automobiles. You can see the models on the table, and he's using that spray to go through and maybe add a little bit more contrast on what's going on. He brings his camera down and lines the edge of that table up to the edge of the sidewalk of the street behind him, and this is what he comes up with. Pretty cool, huh? We were at Monument Valley a couple of weeks ago, and I did a forced perspective shot, taking our vehicle and parking it in such a way and to where I was able to move the camera's film plane to where my foreground matched then the seam of the background of that monument that's to the back of it, and suddenly it forces our perspective, making the truck look like it's bigger than it actually is. All right, enough of that. Continuity is the next one, the law of continuity. And here's where lines become interpreted as following a path of least resistance. All right, to demonstrate this, here we have these lines. One falls into a little different shade. And so the idea, the principle behind this is that the eye follows the ones that are the most same, the path of least resistance, as opposed to changing our idea of what those circles should look like goes a little bit grayer. Line is probably, well, for me at least, one of the greatest influences in design. There's some lines that are classic to me, like the lines, for example, of the Porsche 911. This is the oldest automotive design that hasn't really changed over the years. Let's see, 50, some almost 60 years of the Porsche 911 design when it first came out that way. And you can see as I'll bring in an old 911 here, and I'll bring in a current 911, that greenhouse line remains the same. Back in the 80s, Porsche decided to mess around a little bit with a front engine automobile and change that line, and boy, people sure threw a fit over that. Some other favorite lines of mine, like the Bixby Bridge. This artwork just goes through and depicts the bridge itself just within its line structure. And I know what that is. You might not know what that is if you don't travel Highway 1 a whole lot. But this becomes iconic. Or like with the Golden Gate Bridge at the beginning of this presentation, this line becomes meaningful that way. Or look at the line on this watch. Now, this is pretty cool. No hands here. But we do have the longer part then of this line, that is the minute hand, and we have the shorter part in the middle, that is the hour hand. And as this line goes around and it moves, okay, it drags that hour line around with it as well, and makes a full 360-degree movement of time around that watch just with one line. Pretty cool. Next up is the law of closure, and we're doing this all the time. Objects that are grouped together have a tendency to be seen as a whole, but it goes beyond that because the brain goes through and puts things together as well, since it's seen it so many different times. Well, let me demonstrate this. Objects are grouped together as seen as a whole, so we have these objects here, and I'm going to black it out in the middle. And even though we don't see the object of the triangle, because of the omission of the lines of the three circles and the three triangles, we can go through and say, oh, yeah, I see the triangle that's in there, right? FedEx does this with their logo. Do you see the arrow? Some people do, some people don't. Some people don't see it until now. The junction between the E of X and the X creates this arrow that goes from left to right there. Have you ever been on the Narrows hike in Zion Canyon to go out to the Narrows? I don't know if you've ever noticed the same kind of arrow that's up in a wall there, about 100 yards before you reach the end of the trail. It's up there. It's up on the right-hand side as you go along. and there's this relief of this almost perfect arrow that's almost going at a 45-degree angle to the northwest as it points up there. And it's just a hole in the rock there, but it's fascinating to see the geometry of how this comes together. Closure also works where we might have an idea of what the rest of the object looks like. So here I have my kayak and a paddle, and we're in very shallow water to pull up that kind of dimension of the lake bed behind me. So, but even though we don't see the whole paddle and we don't see the whole boat, we know that that exists, mainly because it's floating, it's functional, and it's there, right? Or in this image of my daughter, I've come in close to go through and see the shape of her face, her eyes. We know that the top of her head is there, right? But through closure, because otherwise she wouldn't be smiling, right? So we go through and make those kinds of psychological conclusions, if you will, in our perception of how things go. So I've gone through this pretty quickly. Use this video to go back and review these concepts. And if you have any questions about those, you know where to post them. Okay? See you later.